I'd like to present a paper that was recently published in the journal Language Sciences. And it has the slightly enigmatic title, Language as a Problem. Now you can go and read the paper, and perhaps you should, but it might be no harm to put it down in video format, at least the main bare bones of the argument. This is fleshed out with a bit of colour and a few anecdotes in the article. But I want to present an argument that language, in particular language as it has been left to the discipline of linguistics to study, is something of a problem. I want to bring forth three clearly distinct senses of the word language, which regrettably frequently get confused because one of them has taken over and is treated as if it were the definition of language. And that is the view of language constructed, defended, elaborated within the discipline of generative linguistics. That should be the most familiar way of talking about language is part of the problem itself. When we speak of language, we usually speak of something which refers to one or other system that goes by the name of English or French or Chinese. Languages are seen as things that you can pick up, you can learn. They are indifferently represented in speech and in writing with different ways of getting at the language bit of them. So here on the slide we can see some Chinese writing and its transliteration, and we can also see translation. We can also see that the same linguistic content expressed in two different ways in Chinese is expressed again in English. This view of language sees language as a bunch of systematic entities, and you can add to your stock of these. You can learn second languages and third languages, although we all know that becomes difficult as you get older. This should be a thoroughly familiar way of thinking about language. This is indeed the predominant sense of the word language, and most people don't fret too much about the activities of linguists. They assume that they're doing their jobs, and there in the bottom right of the screen we can see a technical object from the domain of the generative linguist, which is a phrase structure diagram, a famous one from Noam Chomsky's work, which shows what is presumed to be the linguistic structure, the formal structure, that gives rise to the, as Chomsky would have it, meaningless sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which is nonetheless, despite its oddity, is taken to be a valid sentence of English. It is grammatical. Now, if we ask what the linguists are doing here, what we'll find is that linguistics works with the view that language consists of utterances or texts, sequences, which are made up of units. And for the syntactician, these units are usually words, although we may include morphemes in there. But at the sound level, if we're talking about extracting this language from speech, we speak instead of phonemes, which have an approximate correspondence in letters of writing. And so generative linguistics carefully constructs these disciplines, syntax being concerned with the order of words, phonology with the order of phonemes, morphology sitting somewhere in between, and semantics having a rather complicated but again formal character sitting above syntax. And the means by which these units are sequenced is assumed to be governed by regularities. To put it in its most general sense, these may be expressed as rules within some system, as constraints within others, and what they do is they distinguish well-formed sequences from poorly formed sequences using the notion of grammaticality. Now, there's nothing terribly concerning in anything I've said so far, but I want to make the point that if we ever speak of translation or of the communication of information, then this is the sense in which we are using language. We will draw out two other distinct senses of the term language that are very valuable and somewhat eclipsed by this. And in neither of those will we have recourse to the notion of translation or the communication of information. So it might seem strange to posit a core meaning of the word language that doesn't admit of translation and the communication of information, and that is indeed part of the problem I wish to bring forth. When we use the word language, this sense of language as system is always with us. But I want to show that the word language has at least two other core senses that are quite distinct. One of these, we're going to need names for them. I'm going to call the second one languaging, turning it into a verb, and distinguishing it from the word language. And this verb will be called upon when we are asked to account for the remarkable sequence of events that led to the contemporary human world. Something happened to one species among others. Giraffes have long necks, other animals have fine characteristics, but humans seem to have acquired something which has no parallel in other species, which threatens the existence of the entire planet, and which calls upon us urgently to recognize that we must see ourselves as within the natural order and not distinct from it. This is a puzzle that has been set to us since the theory of evolution from the mid-19th century, the work of Charles Darwin. And I will say that we have very important questions here, and we often call upon language as one of the terms that we need to discuss in this context. And I am going to say that language as system, language in the sense we just used, cannot be used here. So in European accounts, which have for hundreds of years served to motivate the construction of a picture of the human, which was clearly distinct from the animal order, humans having rational souls, there was a somewhat narcissistic view, which was that we were distinguished because of, and the two main candidates are language and reason. We're not going to go into reason here, that would be a different talk. But language has often been called upon as one of the distinguishing characteristics that facilitates, for example, the evolution of tool making and complex civilizations. So language as system has been invoked by linguists as a formal innovation that underlies the communicative ability of our species, and I assert that this is an error. It is an error which the discipline of linguistics continues to make, and an error which the discipline of linguistics continues to fool other disciplines with. Now, it is certainly not in doubt that something happened in the historical trajectory of all species. Something happened to the human species that is quite remarkable. And in order to give a crude index of this, we have admittedly rather vague and hand-waving estimates of the sheer weight of the bodies of mammals in the world. So this is the cumulative biomass of all mammals as estimated at 100,000 years before the present and at the present. And there's a big, big difference in that 100,000 years. The units don't concern us terribly much. There was a lot of mammals around 100,000 years ago. But the current distribution of mammals by weight looks, as you see on the right-hand side there, where nearly all mammals on this planet are either humans or their livestock. Very, very few of them are wild animals. And we can just dig into this just a little bit more, just to drive the point home. At the top of this slide, you can see a similar estimate, and they are vague estimates, for the biomass of mammals on the entire planet from the year 1900 and the year 2000. So just looking at the last 100 years of that 100,000 year shift. And even there, you can see that between 1900 and 2000, the proportion of mammalian biomass attributable to wild animals shrinks dramatically. That attributed to humans stays more or less the same, increases somewhat, and that attributed to livestock gets even larger. So that by now, nearly all mammals on this planet are either humans or livestock. Now, this was an estimate of aggregated biomass. It's just take all the cows in the world and all the goats in the world and all the platypuses in the world and put them all into a basket and weigh them. That doesn't count diversity. Clearly, if so many of the animals are our livestock, that's going to vastly reduce biological diversity. And so it is if we count species. At present, we see there's about 14 mammalian species that make up most of our livestock, and there's about 5,330 wild mammalian species. So vastly more diversity in the wild, but far fewer by number. So it is without a doubt something remarkable happened to humans, and what happened to humans is no longer simply a concern of humans, it is a concern of the planet. So how should we look into this? Well, what I'm going to do is, first of all, take a language-inspired view and just look at the history of writing. That's just for practice here. We're going to have a look at writing, and then we'll look at the history of what we might vaguely indicate as culture. So, on the screen, you can see the red line is supposed to indicate 5,000 years of writing. That's going back as far as ancient Mesopotamia, when writing first emerged as tally marks and basically spreadsheets on pots. Writing originated also in China and in Central America, but the oldest trajectory of writing comes from Mesopotamia, and it's about 5,000 years old. But it didn't all happen at once, and writing has a history. It starts off as tally marks on the outsides of pots, listing transactions, saying what's in there, counting things, and keeping record of sales and transactions. Over time, then, people start making marks not on pots, but on clay tablets. And these clay tablets can take a wider variety of texts, and we eventually find written texts, even literature, emerging on clay tablets. And then there's a long subsequent development, and if we don't have time to trace it all, but obviously this history is going to involve continuous innovation. There will be the use of materials like vellum and parchment and papyrus and eventually paper as well, which is going to greatly transform things. Writing is very much a minority activity done by very few specialists until we get printing and the widespread dissemination of text. So that only happens in the 15th century. And it's only with the widespread dissemination of texts that literacy becomes broadly something one finds in society and not merely the province of an elite. Now, of course, printing is not the only innovation, and innovations continued at the time of Charles Darwin. There were steam-powered printing presses suddenly vastly flooding the British Empire with new texts. And then, of course, in the 20th century, we have the innovation of digital and electronically mediated communication. But as you can see from the timeline here, the 5,000 years of history took a long time to get to the origin of printing, and digitally mediated communication is very, very recent. And emojis are the most recent, one of the most recent changes there. And emojis are wonderful. Emojis are extremely interesting to linguists. They cause all kinds of puzzles. They're very useful. People adopt them. People love them. They have one interesting property, which is that if they're not constrained by code, so that if a Japanese person in writing writes Japanese characters and puts an emoji there, I'll be able to understand the emoji, even if I don't understand the characters. Nonetheless, although emojis are of interest to linguists, if we were to study or try to work out in what ways writing has greatly affected humanity, and it has, we wouldn't start with emojis. Emojis would just not be the right place to start given this trajectory. So that was my warmer-upper, and now we're going to consider what we might, for lack of any word that can do it, culture. There is little evidence for a linguistic-based society or a language-using society before about 50,000 years ago. Our estimates here are very, very crude. The evidence we have to go on is diverse and none of it speaks clearly. But from about 50,000 years, we start finding bone flutes, which suggest that people are making music. We see fire hearths, we see rock art on the walls of caves, and we see the crafting of ritual objects. The 50,000, as I said, is a very crude estimate, and one can argue about the detail. But what is clear is that the culturally saturated human world we live in took a long time to come into being. It's also necessary to note that in virtually all of the time that human culture was developing, human societies were very sparse and were very widely dispersed. So we can make a figure comparable to the last one here. And here I've collapsed the 5,000 years of the history of writing into the top right-hand corner of the figure. And I've put there a single green bar of 50,000 years to index vaguely at the development of what we would recognize as human culture or of our kind. And on the lower half of the graph, I've added the important statistic that we need to bear in mind here, which is world population. Total world population is currently about 7 to 8 billion, and that is a recent development. Before about 1 or 2,000 years ago, the world is vastly underpopulated compared to today. There are very few people around, which means people are living in social groups with only contact with a few other social groups. There are no long-term, long-range trade networks through which massive flows go. People are very, very local. Now, I made the point that if one wanted to understand the manner in which writing has affected humanity, whatever that is, one would not start with emojis. I think from this picture, it's very, very clear that if you want to understand what it is that happened to our species, and you want to look vaguely in the direction of communication or interaction, you would not start with something that demands literacy. You would not even start with something that demands writing. These are late innovations. These are late innovations, and they can bear no relation to what's going on in this 50,000 years. Importantly, in order to have a language as system, some things need to be in place already. You need to have educational curricula, writing conventions, dictionaries. You need to have economic and social distinctions based on language use. And you need labels to distinguish the norm from the deviant, to say that's correct, that's not correct, that's grammatical, that's not grammatical. You cannot get language as system in a complex without having also a complex society. Many have pointed out before that even the object that linguists study, the words and the phonemes, these cannot be found before writing, because all communication is going on embodied, face to face, and is the sounds one is making don't partition into linguistic and non-linguistic elements. All utterances are ephemeral, they go away, and there's no sense of the invariance you get, for example, with a written text. So language as system is only possible once normative social practices are in place. And you got to have things like dictionaries, social pressures, syllabi, writing, schools. All this complexity needs to be there before language as system can exist. And so, language as system, as curated within generative linguistics, is simply not relevant to the question of what happened to our species. And so many of us within linguistics, the renegades among us, have begun using this term languaging. And my preferred definition here, there are several around, is to hand wave again, very ignorantly, at any number of coordinative and affiliative forms of interaction that ultimately give rise to what we might see as a common social domain among persons. Because as this 50,000 years plus of change is going on, not only are communicative practices changing, this is also the period in which agriculture comes into being, and in which humans gain command of metallurgy and begin to make metal tools. and in which human settlements, fixed settlements, the notion of a village or a town, long before cities and empires, these are slowly coming together. The development of textiles and all forms of material craftsmanship are developing in this time. None of this is going on independently of the communicative activities of these folk. Likewise, over that time, the notion of trade is going to arise, ultimately achieving its contemporary importance, but initially in exchanges, local exchanges among groups who are not too distant. And in all that time, right up until someone starts scratching on a Mesopotamian pot, communication or this interaction, social interaction, is always face to face. Every utterance is ephemeral, it's gone as soon as it's spoken. It's embodied, and the interlocutors are co-present to each other. So this so familiar notion that language allows us to communicate over great distances or by mail and so on, none of that is at all possible. It is remarkable that about 40 to 50,000 years ago, these animals, these nascent humans, start to do something quite remarkable around the world in sites, independently in sites in Argentina, in Indonesia, in South Africa, in Spain. People start to take red ochre in their mouth and make handprints on a wall by blowing like that. It's almost like they're waving at us. These are the first people we can see in history. That wave should be taken very seriously. These are our kind, and we recognize them as our kind, and that conviction is reinforced when we find the same people making ritual objects like beads and burying their dead, tending the hearth and making music. Now, when I say these are our kind, suddenly we become aware of something, which is that the biological notion of species is not doing us any favor here. From a biological point of view, given the morphology of the body, Homo sapiens sapiens is about 1 million years old, more or less. And that does not tally with what we're seeing here. So something else is coming into being, and we don't have a biological, much less a physical account of this. Some people have chosen to use other terms then in describing the cultural history of our kind. Homo loquens, the chattering one, is probably my favorite. Others have referred to Homo faber, the tool maker, or Homo ludens, the one who plays. There are many ways to tell stories about where we come from, how we got to where we are. This is where we recognize the origins of what we vaguely indicate as culture, one of those great abstract nouns, but it comes in the recognition of our own kind. So I've made an argument now that language as system in its familiar sense is simply not appropriate as an object in contributing to a discussion of what happened to our species, which is a very, very important question. So those two senses can be distinguished now because I'll call one language a system and the other languaging. There is a third sense of language, independent of the first two, potentially independent of the first two, which is equally important, and we don't have a word for it. So I'm going to use an annoying typographical convention what I'll say is language as identity. The word language here has been crossed out or erased. This typographical trick was introduced by Heidegger and used by Jacques Derrida, but we're going to use it because it's handy to be able to point to a word and say, yes, I have to use the word, but I don't want it to mean what it normally means. Given that we're talking about the long history of our kind, we cannot assume the existence of such high-order structures as nations, states, countries, empires, and so on. And long before such political entities come into being, this language as identity is there as the mark of belonging to a people. That's an extremely important sense of language as identity, which is the mark of belonging somewhere. Now, our words here are not very, very good. In fact, you'll see I've crossed out people because I don't feel confident using terms that make sense to me, like tribe or group or gang or family. We often debate such matters using the term ethnic identity. And that is not a great term, but it does help to capture this notion of belonging, of coming from somewhere. And this language has always been part of that too, which means it's always going to be contested and highly political. We are not in the domain of mathematics and formality here. It was language as a marker of identity that was used by the Nazis in order to justify their claim for Lebensraum, for additional territory in Eastern Europe. And it was used again recently by Russia as they took over the Crimea, because they were saying people speak Russian there, therefore they belong to us. This third sense is also hidden if we assume that language, without any further qualification, means language as system. So there's plenty of room for confusion here. There's the three senses on top, language as system, and only here can we use the words information and translation. At the bottom, we've got language as identity, as belonging. And in the middle, we have this vague set of activities which we're not sure how to even describe, forms of interaction which co-develop with agriculture and everything else, and which allow us ways of composing a common world. Languaging, I've said. So those three terms seem to me to have clearly distinct meanings, and if language as system is allowed to serve as the meaning of the word language, problems arise. And I want to indicate some of these. One of them, one of my favorite targets, comes from that venerable, highly respected Boston linguist Steven Pinker in his book, The Language Instinct. The quotation here is slightly amended by William Dalrymple. But Pinker said, language is a complex specialized skill, which is qualitatively the same in every individual. Language is no more a cultural invention than his upright posture, and men are as naturally as equal in their ability to express themselves as in their ability to stand on two legs. Once you begin to look at language as a biological adaptation to communicate information, it is no longer as tempting to see language as an insidious shaper of thought. When it comes to linguistic form, Pinker says, Plato walks with the Macedonian swineherd, Confucius with the head-hunting savage of Assam. The arrogance of this is utterly gobsmacking. The confusion of terms, the use of things like information and communication, when what he means is, what he's talking about is the constitution of the person. To place language here on the same basis as bilateral symmetry, having legs, the ability to stand on two legs, is to insist that the formalisms studied by generative linguists and then misleadingly thrown into conversations about our origins, that they must rule, and with this, languaging is erased, and with this, identity is erased. And we can see here Steven Pinker is American, but this is a European colonialist, arrogant attitude. Pinker has taken language as system to be a biological fact on par with the capacity to breathe. And he displays no awareness of either languaging, which is necessary to understand whatever it was that happened to our kind, or language as identity, with all of its necessary ethical and political entanglements. By neglecting languaging, he hides the important role of things like education, opportunity, wealth, good and bad fortune, skill and privilege. For having some kind of syntactic capacity won't get you very far in life, but rhetorical skill will, learning to flatter will, learning to speak the language that belongs to the elite will get you very, very far. But this has been elided completely. So he not only elides languaging, but he also elides language's identity, collapsing the distinction between a mega language like English and an ethnic index, and I'm going to use as an example Yamana, which was once spoken in Tierra del Fuego. And here I'd like to follow this thought just a little bit more. I said English is a mega language, and mega languages are a fairly recent thing, and they come about with empires. Before empires, every language's system sort of maps onto a people and their sense of identity and a way of life. But with the origin of big trade routes, with not only colonialism, but the population spread, interaction, and the development of empires, some languages start to take on roles that they don't have when it's simply the way of life of a small group of people. They support communication, trade, and learning across huge communities. Such mega languages will have vocabularies that no one person could know. They will have resources that are entirely unlike the resources of any one small people. They will play roles that are quite unlike the role of what goes on with spoken communication in a village somewhere. Now, the word mega language might suggest a neat category, and God knows human history is not neat. So the principal mega languages, I suspect, are these. That is Mandarin, which plays a remarkable role as a written stabilizing index within the context of Chinese history. And I'm not good on Chinese history, so I won't speak to that. French, Spanish, and Portuguese are mega languages because of the colonial activities of their countries. There are not so many traces of the Dutch and the Germans, but French still in large parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, and Spanish, of course, in Latin America, and Portuguese in Brazil. We see the colonial history here. It's no wonder that these are mega languages. Arabic has a very unique trajectory, which is indelibly tied to the origins of Islam and the role of the Quran. And then there's English. Now, English, of course, has a colonial history, but it has so much more. English is now the means by which academia functions. It's the means by which air traffic control functions. English has taken on remarkable roles. Now, if we follow Pinker, then English is an object, just like Yamana is an object. And you probably don't know Yamana, so here's the Yamana people. And we obliterate such people when we confuse language's system with language's identity. This is one of the documentary photographs that were prepared mainly in the end of the 19th century of these people, who were one of many diverse people who lived in Tierra del Fuego at the very southern tip of South America, a very cold place, which was continuously occupied by humans for about 10,000 years. The first encounters with Europeans happened in the 16th century, and they were relatively infrequent and only became of great consequence in the 19th century. And if you read the paper, you'll find out Charles Darwin's personal role in all this. So Darwin passed by there about 1832 or something like this. On the second Beagle voyage, they actually brought someone with them who was going to work as a missionary, and it didn't work out. He had to go get a safer job somewhere else. But by 1870, an Anglican missionary by the name of Thomas Bridges had joined there, and he undoubtedly wanted to help these people, civilize them even. So we have the first sustained contact here about 1870, and by about 1920 the Europeans had exterminated this people through disease, through stealing their land. There were, at the start of the 20th century, there were still rewards to be obtained from commercial enterprises for coming back with the ears or the hands of these people. So Europeans went there with mixed intentions, and they exterminated them. There are still some people who have partial Yamana lineage, but the people as a coherent entity was obliterated. Now, the presence of missionaries in the story of colonial expansion is not an accidental feature of this story. And we have some very interesting documents pertaining to the first missionary who went there, Thomas Bridges. As I said, a man with the best intentions in the world. He prepared the first English Yamana dictionary, and he found it difficult, as anyone doing field linguistics, trying to document an unwritten language, the idea, has found. So here's Thomas Bridges' own notes. He says, the natives pronounce so indistinctly the following letters, phonemes, that it is very difficult to fix upon the proper letter satisfactorily. So they're getting their d and t mixed up, their k and t, their f and p, their j and ch, their s and sh, getting all mixed up. In writing this language, he encounters a lot of doubt. I've been much hindered by this indistinctness of pronunciation, being awful doubtful which phoneme to choose. His last sentence here is telling. No doubt when they learn to read, when they learn to read this language, their pronunciation will be strengthened. The literate European missionary is coming in here, and he believes that learning to write what he knows as their language, and on his terms, will improve them. So, having genocided this people, what about their language? Did we manage to save it? Did Thomas Bridges manage to save it? You know, you've heard a lot of work about endangered languages. Well, if we search for the Yamana language today, we'll find some texts, believe it or not. We'll find a grammar of no relevance to the Yamana people who didn't have languages system. We'll find a dictionary of no help to the Yamana people. And we'll find translations of the Gospels. And we'll find translations of the Acts of the Apostles. None of these texts have anything to do with the Yamana people. They are purely impositions, but they are not accidental that they feature in this way in this story. There is one recording of a surviving chant, unfortunately sundered from its context, so we have no idea what that chant affected within their communities. I'll come back to chant later. So what has been missed here? Well, according to Pinker and the standard view of generative linguistics, is that English is a system and Yamana is a system, and no one is more complex than the other. They're entirely on a par and they're biological. I find this obscene. We've seen that English plays a role in living completely different from that of any ethnic index, any language as identity. I do believe that English can be usefully viewed as a technology for global communication. It is the language, the predominant language on the internet. It's the language of air traffic control, of trade, maritime shipping, academia, and so on. Other languages have played roles like Latin and Greek in the past, and English plays this role today. Who are the people of English? Lord knows, it's not some farmers in Devon. Anyway, they cannot claim that language as being theirs. And I speak as an Irish person who was brought up speaking English, but without English being the hallmark of my people. Such battles in Ireland revolve around a language called Irish. We're very sensitive to this. Now, the fact that the language as system brought forth by Europeans of the Yamana should be purely biblical is not an accident, and this is a very important point. The very notion of language as a system became clear as the European empire spread across the globe, accompanied by missionaries. And a language as system was a border. The missionaries went out, moved through new countries, and when they had to translate the damn Bible again, they knew they'd met a language, another language. That was the operational characteristic by which the border between one system and another was defined. It was the need to translate the Christian Bible. Now, this may be somewhat shocking, but linguists and the general public today believe that we can count languages and that there are endangered languages. And there's databases and resources for doing this. Ethnologue is the standard database of languages, and it's built on work done by the Summer Institute of Linguistics, who have a long and venerable history in the discipline of linguistics. One of their presidents was Kenneth Pike, a famous phonetician, and so on. What is not widely known is that Summer Institute of Linguistics and the Ethnologue database of languages come from a Christian missionary organization even today. They might appear to be scientific and therefore belonging to the secular order, but they are continuous with this missionary past that we just saw that imposed the Bible on the Yamana. So this is a kind of a problem that arises if we confuse language as system with language as an ethnic marker, or if we refuse, as Pinker does, to even acknowledge that language has something to do with belonging. Now I want to turn to the vaguest of the three senses, languaging, which I described as a loose set of coordinative and affiliative behaviors that give rise to the common social world. How the hell are we ever going to get a fix on that? Well, I spent 15 years studying one form of languaging, which is hiding in plain sight. I've given it the term joint speech because, remarkably, linguists hadn't seen anything here. They didn't feel the need to name this. You know it as chant, but I use a slightly more precise term because I want to be careful and ensure that I have a well-formed empirical object of study. When multiple people utter the same thing at the same time, we are in the presence of joint speech. And it turns out to be something that people do all the time, everywhere. You do it, I do it, we all do it. We do it, though, not at arbitrary times, not all day. We do it in processes of ritual, prayer, protest, sports, education, and the swearing of public oaths, and a few other places. So what I'm suggesting is that joint speech links the following three examples together. Here, for example, is joint speech in a temple. And here's joint speech on the streets in Syria in a protest. And just for fun, here's joint speech among some Manchester City fans. And we could put it in the primary school classroom there as well. So one interesting thing about joint speech is it's a well-formed object. We can agree when we're looking at it. That's rather rare in the human and social sciences. And whenever we find joint speech, there's something interesting going on. So we're drawn to these domains, the domain of ritual, the domain of protest, the domain of sports, and the domain of primary education. Now, I've worked on this for 15, 20 years, and I'm not giving a talk here on joint speech, but I just want to mention some properties of joint speech, which might make it more comprehensible why linguistics has expressed no interest whatsoever in this form of languaging, despite its obvious foundational character for all human societies. So speakers and listeners in joint speaking are not separate, and the texts are known by everyone and they're composed elsewhere. That leaves the linguist with little to work on, given their focus on language as system. People repeat what's said again and again. It needs to be said. It is performative. Taking part matters. And in this way, one's identity as a Manchester United fan, one's identity as a protester, one's identity as a Buddhist is brought forth. Identities are enacted. So this is very close to the erased sense of language where it's connected with identity. And I'm not suggesting identity is simple. An interesting thing about joint speech, which we won't go into further, is that there's no divide between speaking and music. One might think joint speech can carry only very simple messages, but we're not talking about communication and the exchange of information. In fact, text spoken using joint speech and associated formats can be of the highest possible complexity, and they are curated and can be curated over thousands of years. We see them as liturgy, for example. And when they are so used, they have to be protected, for example, by priests or other specialists. But people still get to join in the utterance through the formal means of generalized assent, as when we say amen, or right on at a protest, or hell yeah. In this way, many people get to participate in the bringing forth of a single utterance. Now, such practices are much older than writing, but we have very little in the way of evidence. So to substantiate that, I'll just point to what is perhaps the first piece of literature that we have. So we followed the history of writing from ancient Mesopotamia, started about 3000 before the Common Era. By about 2600 before the Common Era, we find there's two texts of equal antiquity. One is a bunch of aphorisms, and the other is this, which is the Kesh Temple Hymn. It's a text that has been found in multiple copies, and in fact it was preserved over 1,000 years, a clear index of a highly valued text. It was preserved as the ambient language switched from Sumerian to Akkadian, and it is a liturgical hymn. So it speaks of highly developed practices of ritual already. Now, I'm obviously not going to read this for you. Philologists have managed to extract the words from this. There's the text just for what it's worth, but there's something interesting, even without reading the words, that you can see here. You've got verse-chorus structure. This hymn consists of a series of verses, and each verse ends in the same identical line. This is a familiar structure to us. We know the verse chorus structure from lots of rituals. We know it from our music. We know it from pop music. We know it from jazz. The chorus is when everyone joins in. And the chorus here, we might as well bring it back into being, says, will anyone else bring forth something as great as Kesh? Will any other mother ever give birth to someone as great as the hero Ashki? Who has ever seen anyone as great as its lady Nintur? Rhetorical questions, but they recur again and again at the end of each verse. So chant is already there, and ritual and practices at the very, very birth of writing. So where are we now? Since about the middle of the 19th century, we have to accept that we are within the natural order and not separate from it. This is a challenge that we are still grappling with. The ecological crisis makes us very, very uncomfortably aware of, and it leads to an urgent need to consider what happened to our species, what is our kind, and what are our relations. Since at least the end of the Second World War, we are globalized. English is now the global means of communication, but it is no longer at all the language of a people. We confront imminent planetary changes, the climate, the mass extinction we find ourselves living in. These make the job of reconsidering how we view ourselves and others and other species mandatory. Our sciences have always been developing and changing. This is my indictment of contemporary linguistics. Linguistics urgently needs to get out of its ivory tower and reconnect with the living and the processes of life. The problem I set out to delineate here is three distinct senses of language. One, language of system with all the associated vocabulary of translation and communication of information. An important sense, no doubt, but fetishized now and become a problem because taking this as the sole or the default meaning of language pollutes all discussion of both languaging, those forms, ways of composing a common world, one of which we've just seen, very clear, very obvious, very contemporary, and the sense of identity. Perhaps the most urgent sense of problem I get from this is this obliteration of identity when we think that we have somehow saved the language by going to its people and prodding them enough so that we can write another version of the Bible. The very notion of an endangered language distracts us from the endangerment of its people. The fetishization of formal generative linguistics is an arrogant European colonial attack on people who are not helped by having the Bible translated into their language. I'll shut up now. There's some websites there. You can pause the video. There's a link to a free book on chanting or joint speech, and I can be contacted here if anyone wants to discuss these things. Thank you very much.